The train whistle cried as the sun rose above the wide, empty prairie. The dusty station stood quiet, with only a few townsfolk gathered to see who had arrived on the early morning train. A young woman stepped down from the wooden steps, clutching a small suitcase that carried all her belongings. Her dress, though neat, showed the signs of a long and tiring journey. Her eyes searched the faces of the waiting crowd, expecting to see a man holding a hat in his hands waiting with a smile to greet her. But the platform was silent and no one came forward. Her name was Clara. She had traveled thousands of miles, crossing the ocean, then endless plains, guided only by letters filled with promises. Those letters spoke of a new life, a warm home, and a man who needed a wife by his side. She had believed every word. But now, as the train left behind a trail of smoke and disappeared into the horizon, Clara stood alone, her heart heavy with doubt. The townsfolk whispered among themselves. A pair of older women looked her up and down, one of them muttering, "That must be the mail-order bride." Another man shook his head and said quietly, "Shame he didn't even show." Clara felt her cheeks burn. She had imagined a welcome, perhaps flowers or at least a kind smile. Instead, she was met with stares that made her feel like an outsider before she had even taken a step into town. She tried to stand tall, pressing her lips together so they would not tremble. With each passing minute, the hope that her husband-to-be would appear began to fade. The sun rose higher, its heat settling on her shoulders, yet she shivered inside. She thought of home, the small village she had left, the friends who had warned her not to trust promises written on paper. Clara had answered with courage, believing she was stepping into a better future. Now she wondered if she had only stepped into disappointment. She sat on a bench by the station, her suitcase at her feet. A few curious children watched her, whispering to one another, but their parents quickly pulled them away. No one offered help. Even the station master avoided her gaze as he returned to his office. Clara looked down at her hands, still wearing the little gloves she had put on that morning, hoping to impress. They now felt like a costume for a play that had no audience. A kindly woman, perhaps in her 50s, approached at last. She wore a faded bonnet and carried a basket. She spoke gently. "Are you waiting for someone, dear?" Clara nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, my husband-to-be. He promised he would meet me here." The woman's eyes softened, but there was sadness in her face. "I'm sorry, child. Folks say he left town last night. Packed up quick and gone. Left debts behind, too." Clara's heart sank. It was as if the ground shifted beneath her feet. She whispered, "Gone?" The woman touched her shoulder lightly. "I don't know the details, but he ain't here, and he won't be coming back, not anytime soon." With that, the woman sighed and walked on, leaving Clara to face the truth alone. The young bride stared at the horizon where the sun burned bright. She had dreamed of stepping into a home filled with warmth. Instead, she had been left behind before her story could even begin. Her throat tightened as she thought of her family back home. They had sacrificed to help her make this journey, trusting she would find happiness here. How could she write to them now, telling them she had been abandoned before the first day was done? The hours stretched on, and Clara felt every second. She carried her suitcase through the streets, hoping for some kindness. But the townsfolk only whispered louder, their voices like needles pricking her courage. "Poor girl," someone said. "What's she gonna do now?" Others shook their heads. "She won't last out here on her own." Clara kept walking, her steps small and slow, but her pride pushed her forward. She would not let them see her cry. At last she reached the edge of town where the land stretched wide and open. The prairie grass swayed in the morning breeze, golden under the sun. She set her suitcase down and sat on a rock, staring out at the endless horizon. She felt like the world had grown too large for her, too wild and unforgiving. A tear slid down her cheek, but she quickly brushed it away. She had not come all this way to be broken. She told herself she would find strength even if she did not yet know how. The morning air carried the sound of horses' hooves in the distance, but she did not turn. She thought it was only a ranch hand heading out to the fields. She pulled her shawl closer and breathed deeply. In her heart, she tried to gather courage, whispering a small prayer that perhaps her story was not over, that maybe, just maybe, something unexpected would happen. The prairie stretched wide and silent, and Clara sat there waiting, abandoned at dawn but not yet defeated. The town was alive with whispers the morning after Clara's arrival. In a place as small as this western town, news traveled fast, faster than the prairie winds. Everyone knew that a mail-order bride had come on the train, only to find herself abandoned before she could even step into the new life she had been promised. Men at the saloon talked in low voices, shaking their heads over their drinks. Women carrying baskets along the street paused to glance at Clara as she passed. Some eyes filled with pity, others sharp with judgment. Clara tried to keep her back straight. Her chin lifted, but inside she felt like a fragile bird caught in a storm. She had not slept much the night before, turning restlessly on the stiff mattress of the boarding house where she had found shelter. The kind landlady had given her a small room for a few coins, but even there she could hear the murmur of voices below, talk of the poor foreign bride who was left on her own. The words pierced her like thorns. She wanted to be strong, but loneliness pressed heavy on her chest. By mid-morning she walked to the general store, her worn gloves covering hands that trembled slightly. She needed small things, soap, a comb, maybe some bread. But as she entered, the bell over the door rang and heads turned. A hush fell over the store. She felt dozens of eyes on her, and for a moment she wished she could disappear. Behind the counter, Mr. Henson, the storekeeper, cleared his throat and greeted her. His voice was kind enough, but even he could not hide the pity in his eyes. "What can I get you today, miss?" he asked. Clara managed a small smile, whispering her request. As he wrapped the items, two women near the shelves spoke in hushed tones, but their words still carried across the room. "She came all the way out here for nothing," one said. "A foolish thing to do," replied the other. "Imagine trusting a stranger's promise." Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she did not answer. She simply took her parcel, thanked the storekeeper, and walked out with as much grace as she could gather. The sunlight outside was blinding after the dimness of the store, but it gave her a strange strength too. She told herself she must not let their words destroy her. She would find her way somehow. Later that afternoon, she sat on the porch of the boarding house watching the street. Wagons rolled by, horses clopped along the dusty road, and children ran in small groups, their laughter ringing through the air. Yet even in that cheerful sound, she felt the sting of being apart, of not belonging. A group of boys paused near the porch, staring openly at her. One of them whispered to another, "That's the bride who got left." Their giggles followed as they ran off, leaving Clara with tears pricking at her eyes. Inside the boarding house, the landlady, Mrs. Keene, tried to offer comfort. "Don't mind them, dear," she said gently while pouring Clara a cup of tea. "People always talk. Give them time, and they'll find someone else to gossip about." Clara nodded, grateful, but deep down she wondered how long she could endure the stares, the whispers, the constant reminder of her misfortune. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, Clara walked to the small church at the edge of town. The door was open and she slipped inside. The wooden benches were empty, the air filled with the faint scent of candle wax. She knelt at the front, bowing her head. For the first time since she had arrived, she allowed her tears to fall freely. She prayed softly, asking for courage, asking for guidance. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Please do not let this be the end of my story. Show me what I must do." She stayed there until the last light of day faded, then returned to the boarding house with a quiet strength she had not felt before. But the town did not forget. The next morning, Clara overheard two men outside the saloon talking about the man who had abandoned her. "He ran off owing half the town," one said. "Guess he figured skipping out on his bride was easier than facing the law." The other chuckled bitterly. "Poor girl, left with nothing but shame." The words cut deep, but they also sparked something inside Clara. Shame, yes. But was it hers to carry? She had come here in trust and good faith. If anyone should feel shame, it was the man who had broken his word, not her. She realized she could not let herself be crushed by what others said. Still, the path ahead looked uncertain. She had no husband, no family here, and only a few coins left in her purse. At night, she sat by the window in her small room, staring at the stars scattered across the dark sky. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the town, wild and vast. She thought of the stories she had read, of women who had crossed oceans and plains to build new lives. Some had faced hardships worse than hers, yet they had endured. Could she do the same? Could she carve out a place in this rough land even without the man she had been promised? Her heart ached with loneliness, but within her there was a quiet determination that refused to die. She told herself that she would not run back home in defeat, not yet. She would wait a little longer, see what tomorrow might bring. For in her heart, though she felt abandoned, she also sensed that her story was not yet finished, and somewhere beyond the horizon, in the silence of the prairie, another soul had already heard of her plight. A rancher who lived miles away, a man who carried his own loneliness, was turning her story over in his mind. While Clara whispered her prayers at night, he lay awake in his cabin, staring at the wooden ceiling, wondering if he had the courage to change both their fates. The town still gossiped. The shame still clung like dust to her name, but the wheel of fate had begun to turn. What had started as scandal might yet become something far greater, though Clara could not see it yet. For now she sat alone watching the stars, unaware that destiny was already riding toward her. The news of Clara's abandonment did not stay in town alone. Word traveled fast across the prairie, carried from the saloon to the fields, from the general store to the ranches that dotted the land. Among those who heard it was a man named Daniel, a quiet rancher who lived several miles from town. Daniel was known for his steady ways. He worked hard, spoke little, and lived alone in the cabin he had built with his own hands. People respected him for his honesty, though many said he carried a loneliness that clung to him like a shadow. When Daniel first heard the story, he was loading hay into his wagon. A neighbor passing by called out, "Did you hear about the bride? Poor thing was left at the station. He ran off before she even stepped foot here." Daniel paused, the pitchfork still in his hands. He frowned, the words settling deep inside him. He did not answer, but the thought stayed with him as he returned to his work. That night, Daniel sat by the fire in his cabin. The flames crackled, throwing shadows on the walls. He held a cup of black coffee, but his thoughts were far away. He remembered what it was like to be lonely, to feel the weight of silence pressing down each night. He had lost his parents years ago and had never married. His ranch kept him busy, yet no amount of work could quiet the emptiness in his home. He thought of the young woman sitting alone in a boarding house, her dreams shattered, her courage tested. Something stirred inside him, a mix of sympathy and determination. The next day he tried to push the thought aside. He rode out to check his cattle, mended fences, and gathered supplies. But everywhere he went, he heard her story again. Men at the blacksmith shop shook their heads and said it was a shame. Women at the well whispered about how she had cried in church. Each word tightened the pull in Daniel's heart. That evening, he stood on the porch of his cabin looking out at the wide stretch of land. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple as the sun set. He felt the cool wind brush against his face. He thought of how no woman should be left to face such cruelty. Not here. Not in this harsh land where survival itself was hard. He whispered to himself, "It ain't right. She deserves better." All night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams above his bed. His mind wrestled with doubt. Would she accept help from a stranger? Would the town mock him for stepping in? But another voice inside him answered, "Better to be mocked for kindness than to live with regret." By dawn, his decision was clear. As the first light of morning touched the prairie, Daniel saddled his horse. The animal snorted and stamped, eager for the ride. Daniel tightened the straps, adjusted his hat, and slipped his rifle into its place. Not for battle, but as any rancher would when traveling across the open land. He mounted and nudged the horse forward, the sound of hooves striking the earth echoing in the stillness. The ride into town was long but familiar. The wind carried the scent of grass and a hawk circled above. Daniel's thoughts stayed fixed on the woman he had never met. He imagined her sitting on a porch, staring at the street with sad eyes. He wondered if she was strong enough to endure the whispers, or if she was already planning to return home. Each step of his horse felt heavy with purpose. By the time he reached the edge of town, the sun was higher in the sky. Dust rose around him as he rode past wagons and cattle. People looked up, tipping their hats, recognizing the quiet rancher who rarely visited town unless he needed supplies. He rode straight to the boarding house, his heart steady, though his hands tightened on the reins. There she was, just as he had imagined. Clara sat on the wooden porch, her suitcase beside her, her shoulders slightly bent as though carrying the weight of the world. She stared at the street, lost in thought, unaware of him at first. Daniel stopped his horse and dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. For a moment, he simply watched her. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a sadness that struck him deeply. Yet even in her sorrow, there was a quiet dignity, a strength that had not been broken. Daniel took off his hat, holding it in his hands as he stepped closer. "Miss," he said softly, his voice steady but kind. She looked up, startled, her eyes widening at the sight of the tall rancher standing before her. "I heard what happened," he continued, "and I couldn't let it be. No woman deserves to be left that way." Clara blinked, unsure of how to respond. She had expected pity from many, but not this quiet strength, not this simple honesty. Her lips parted, but no words came. Daniel went on, his tone gentle. "I got a ranch, a home with plenty of room. I've lived alone for too long. I don't mean to frighten you, but I'd be honored if you'd let me give you shelter, a chance to start again. No promises of riches, just respect and an honest life." The townsfolk passing by slowed their steps, curious eyes watching the scene unfold. Whispers began again, but Daniel ignored them. His eyes stayed on Clara, steady and true. For a long moment, Clara sat still. Her heart raced, torn between fear and hope. She had been betrayed once already. Could she trust another man so soon? Yet there was something in his eyes, something different. He did not look at her with pity or scorn. He looked at her as though she mattered, as though her worth had not been stolen by her misfortune. Her hands trembled slightly as she whispered, "Why? Why would you do this for me, a stranger?" Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Because no one should be left alone in a land this harsh. And because I reckon I don't want to be alone anymore either." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked into his eyes and saw no deception, only a quiet honesty. Slowly she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then maybe I will accept your kindness." Daniel's heart lifted, though he kept his expression calm. He extended his hand, strong and steady. Clara hesitated only for a moment before placing her delicate hand in his. A spark passed between them, not of passion alone, but of two souls recognizing the chance to mend their broken pieces together. The townsfolk, once filled with judgment, now watched in silence. Some smiled, others shook their heads, but all felt the weight of something remarkable happening before them. Daniel led Clara to his horse, lifting her gently as though she were made of glass. She sat carefully, her suitcase tied to the back. Daniel mounted behind, his hand steadying her. With a click of his tongue, the horse moved forward, carrying them both out of town. The whispers faded behind them, replaced by the sound of hooves striking the open road. The prairie stretched wide before them, filled with both uncertainty and promise. Clara looked ahead, her fear easing little by little. She did not know what the future would hold. But for the first time since her arrival, she felt she was not alone, and Daniel, riding with the weight of her trust in his hands, felt his heart stir in a way it had not for many years. He knew this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning worth claiming. The prairie wind carried a gentle hush as Daniel's horse moved slowly away from the town. Clara sat in front of him, her hands gripping the saddle horn tightly, her heart still uncertain. She could feel the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her, hear the creak of leather straps, and sense Daniel's calm presence behind her. She had never ridden across open land like this, and each step took her farther from the shame of the station and closer to a life she could not yet imagine. When they reached the quiet edge of town, Daniel guided the horse to a stop near a grove of cottonwood trees. He slid down first, then carefully helped Clara dismount. She stood on the soft earth, smoothing her dress nervously, her eyes lowered. Daniel held his hat in his hand, unsure how to begin. He was not a man used to long speeches, but he knew he must choose his words with care. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice steady but gentle, "I don't mean to rush you or frighten you. I only wanted you to know that you don't have to face this land alone. I got room at my ranch. I've lived there long enough without company. You'd be welcome, not as a burden, but as someone who belongs." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt and hope at the same time. "Why would you take me in?" "You don't know me. I might be nothing but trouble." Daniel shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I reckon I don't need to know every detail of your past to see what's right in front of me. You're strong, stronger than you think. You came across oceans and plains with nothing but faith in a promise. That takes courage. And I know enough about this land to say that courage is worth more than gold." His words touched something deep in her. For days she had only heard whispers of shame, pity, or judgment. This was the first time someone had spoken to her with respect, reminding her of her own strength instead of her weakness. She blinked back, tears lifting her chin slightly. "I'm afraid, Daniel. Afraid of making another mistake, of trusting the wrong man again." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze steady. That's fair. I can't erase what happened to you, but I can promise you this, I'll treat you with honesty. I won't make promises I can't keep. All I ask is that you give me a chance to prove it. Silence hung between them, filled only by the rustle of leaves and the call of a distant meadowlark. Clara felt her heart beat faster, not from fear but from the weight of choice. She could walk back into town, face the whispers again, and perhaps find work scrubbing floors for coins. Or she could place her trust in this quiet rancher, who stood before her with nothing but sincerity in his eyes. Finally, she whispered, I don't know if I can give my hand so quickly, but I can try to trust you. Daniel's expression softened. He extended his hand, large and rough from years of work. Then that's all I ask. Let's start with trust. Clara hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle, steadying her like a rock in a storm. Something shifted inside her then, a flicker of hope that perhaps she had not been abandoned by fate after all. When they mounted the horse again, Daniel rode more slowly this time, mindful of her comfort. As they moved across the prairie, the town faded into the distance. Clara looked back once, seeing the rooftops shrinking against the horizon. The shame and pain tied to that place began to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of possibility. Hours later, they reached Daniel's ranch. It was a simple spread, a sturdy cabin of weathered wood, a barn with a sloping roof and fields stretching far and wide. Chickens clucked near the coop, and a pair of dogs barked as they approached, tails wagging eagerly. Clara felt a strange warmth at the sight. This was no grand estate, but it was alive, cared for, and filled with quiet dignity. Daniel helped her down from the horse once more, then gestured toward the cabin. It ain't fancy, but it's home. If you'll have it, it can be your home too. Clara stepped forward slowly, her eyes taking in the neat rows of tools by the barn, the smoke curling gently from the chimney, the rocking chair on the porch. She touched the wooden railing, feeling its strength beneath her fingers. For the first time since arriving in this strange land, she felt a sense of belonging stir within her. That evening, Daniel prepared a simple supper, bread, beans, and stew cooked in a heavy iron pot. They ate at the small wooden table, the firelight casting a warm glow. Clara ate quietly at first, unsure how to fill the silence, but Daniel spoke softly, asking about her journey, her family, and her hopes. She found herself answering little by little, her voice growing steadier with each word. He listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving hers. When she faltered, he did not press, only waited patiently. By the time the meal was done, Clara felt lighter, as though the burden she had carried since her arrival had begun to ease. After supper, Daniel showed her to the small room at the back of the cabin. It had a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window looking out over the fields. It's yours, he said simply. Rest easy. You're safe here. Clara stood in the doorway, her eyes shining with unspoken gratitude. She whispered, Thank you. Daniel tipped his hat, his voice low. You don't owe me thanks. Just give it time. That's all I ask. Then he left her to rest. That night, Clara lay awake for a while, staring at the stars through the window. For the first time since her arrival, she did not feel completely alone. There was still fear in her heart, but also a new spark of hope. She thought of Daniel's steady voice, his honest eyes, his promise of respect. Perhaps her story was not one of abandonment after all, but of finding something unexpected. In the quiet cabin, with the prairie winds whispering outside, a new chapter of her life had begun. It was not the one she had planned, but it was real, and it was hers to claim. The morning sun rose gently over the wide prairie, painting the fields with gold. Clara woke in the small room Daniel had given her, listening to the sounds of the ranch coming alive. She heard the soft clucking of hens, the bark of a dog, and the distant call of cattle. For a moment she lay still, trying to believe this was real. Just a few days ago she had been sitting alone at the station, humiliated and broken. Now she was in a place that felt safe, a place where she had been offered kindness without demand. She dressed quietly and stepped outside. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the smell of earth and wood smoke. Daniel was already at work, carrying buckets of water from the well. When he saw her, he lifted his hat in greeting. Morning, Clara, he said simply. She nodded, a small smile on her lips. He handed her a cup of warm milk and some bread. They ate together on the porch, the dog sitting at their feet. The silence between them was not heavy like before, but calm, like two people learning to share space without words. Clara felt something she had not felt in a long time: peace. As the day went on, Daniel showed her around the ranch. He explained how the cattle were moved from one pasture to another, how the barn was stocked for winter, and how the hens provided more eggs than one man could eat alone. Clara listened with interest, her mind slowly picturing herself as part of this life. She asked questions and he answered patiently, never rushing her, never making her feel small. At noon, they shared a meal of stew and cornbread. Clara found herself laughing softly when one of the dogs stole a piece of bread right from Daniel's plate. He chuckled too, and the sound was warm and deep, filling the little cabin with something that felt like family. Clara realized she had not laughed since leaving home, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her. That afternoon, they rode out together across the fields. Daniel gave her the gentlest horse and walked beside it, teaching her how to guide it with the reins. At first, Clara was nervous, her hands trembling as the horse moved under her, but Daniel's calm voice soothed her. Easy now. You're in charge. The horse can feel your courage. Bit by bit, her fear turned into excitement. The prairie stretched wide before her, endless and beautiful. She breathed deeply, feeling alive in a way she hadn't since leaving her homeland. When they returned, the sky was glowing with the colors of sunset. Clara helped Daniel gather firewood, her dress catching little flecks of dust and straw. She didn't mind. For the first time, she felt useful, part of something bigger than herself. That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. Clara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and Daniel sat nearby, his hat resting on his knee. For a long while, they said nothing, simply listening to the crickets sing. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Clara," he said quietly, "I can't promise riches or grand things, but I can promise you an honest life. I'll work hard, I'll keep you safe, and I'll treat you with respect. If you'll stay, I'd like to share this ranch with you, not just as a guest, but as my partner." Clara's heart beat fast. She looked at him, his face lit by the soft glow of the moon. There was no trick in his eyes, no false promise, only sincerity. She thought of the man who had abandoned her, of the shame she had carried through the streets of town, and then she thought of Daniel, who had ridden into town not to mock her, but to claim her with kindness. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of hope returning. She placed her hand gently over his. "Daniel," she whispered, "I don't need riches either. All I ever wanted was a place where I belonged, and someone who truly cared. I think I've found both here." A smile touched his lips, slow and genuine. He squeezed her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. At that moment, the weight of her abandonment lifted completely. She was no longer the bride left at dawn. She was a woman chosen at sunset, not out of duty, but out of respect and genuine care. The next morning, when Clara and Daniel rode into town together, whispers rose again among the townsfolk. But this time the whispers carried a different tone. Some nodded in approval, others smiled quietly. Maybe fate had its own plans, someone said. Even those who had judged her before could not help but admire the way the quiet rancher had claimed her hand with dignity. Clara walked beside Daniel with her head held high. She no longer felt the sting of shame. She was not alone, not cast aside. She was part of something new, something strong. The gossips who once pitied her now watched with respect, perhaps even envy. Together, Daniel and Clara left the town behind once more, riding out toward the open prairie. The land stretched wide and endless, filled with challenge but also with promise. Clara leaned slightly against Daniel as the horse carried them forward, her heart full. Life would not be easy. There would be storms, hardships, and long days of labor. But there would also be laughter, companionship, and the steady strength of a man who had chosen her when others had turned away. And for Clara, that was worth more than all the promises written in letters that faded with time. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was sinking low, painting the horizon with fire. Clara looked out at the fields, at the cabin, at the place that would now be her home. She felt the future stretching before her, bright and strong. She smiled, whispering to herself, "What began as shame at dawn has turned into promise by sunset." Daniel heard her words and nodded. Yes, he said softly, a new beginning. And so, under the wide sky of the Wild West, Clara's story did not end in abandonment but in hope, respect, and the steady hand of a man who chose her not out of convenience but out of true courage.